Mike Burgess, welcome to the programme.
Thank you.
You've lifted the national terrorism threat level to probable. What does probable mean in the world of intelligence?
So it's a greater than 50% chance that in the next 12 months an individual or small group of individuals will go to violence with little or no warning, either conduct an act of terrorism or plan an act of terrorism.
So what's changed? What has your organisation seen that's changed to warrant this?
Well, certainly. So ASIO's role is to set the national terrorism threat level. It was last lowered in November 2022, and that was off the back of its raising in 2014 when we had the caliphate starting and we had an ideology and charismatic individuals that were radicalising people and taking them to do attacks onshore.
And just to remind people, that's ISIS when you're talking about the caliphate, that's ISIS.
That's correct, yes. Obviously in 2022 we saw a significant drop-off in our caseload. The caliphate had been defeated and it wasn't resonating here onshore, and we had a good news story of a great number of people no longer a problem to security. Since that time though, obviously the environment has changed, particularly in the last 10, 12 months. Today we have, and it's completely different to when it was raised in 2014. More people are being radicalised more quickly, more people think violence is permissible from a range of grievances and ideologies, not just what we saw when we raised it in 2014.
Now, in the last 4 months, you said today there have been 8 attacks or disruptions involving alleged terrorism or potential acts of terrorism. Did those incidents, those 8 events, specifically lead to the change today?
Not directly. Of course, one incident or a couple of incidents are not a reason to raise the threat level, but they are an indication of what we're seeing in society. Across those 8 incidents we're talking about, 5 of them involved minors or youth. The oldest was 21, the youngest was 14. The other, across the 8, there's an equal mix of religiously motivated, nationalist and racist violent extremism, and in one case a mixed ideology that goes to the left and right, and deliberately I say those words, which defies logic, but it's an indication of the broad set and the mixing set of ideologies where people think violence is the answer. They were all but 2 unknown to us and police. So this is the new thing. People will go to violence with little or no warning and they won't be known to us, or little or no planning in the cases of some of these that I've talked about.
So people, of course, will remember the event in Wakely, the stabbing of the bishop, and then a series of counter-terrorism raids that took place. So you're talking about 6 incidents or events since that time.
That's correct.
What can you tell us about those events?
Well, more broadly, again, they're symptomatic of what we're seeing in society. Increased temperature, violence is more permissible, and a range of ideologies. So we see that. Religiously motivated, nationalist and racist, and mixed ideology. Minors are in the mix. The youth are particularly vulnerable, driven by social media, that isolation problem. It's easier to be radicalised. And of course, people are being radicalised quickly. The internet is a great thing, but it also allows individuals to catch on to something and get there in a matter of days, not months or years, and that's particularly concerning.
Now, in February, you warned that Sunni violent extremism, well, you said that Sunni violent extremism poses the greatest religiously motivated threat in Australia. How much is that driving this threat assessment, just to be clear? So
not much of that is driving that. Yes, that is certainly in our mix, and if I can be clear, of course, when I say Sunni violent extremism, I'm talking about people who have, a small number of people who have a perverse view of the religion, Islam. They don't represent the religion. They believe they do, but that's not people of Islamic faith. But that is a factor in our environment, but that's not the reason why we've raised the threat level today.
In these 8 examples, how much of those are religiously motivated?
There's a few in there. It's not more than half though, and it's not half actually. There's an equal mix of religious and broader ideological or mixed ideology. Talk
to us about that mixed ideology so we understand it. When you say ideological, what ideologies?
So one particular incident, we have an individual that's latched onto Antifa, so extreme left wing, but actually in the manifesto there's Neonazis. That defies logic. I'd suggest they're not really hooked on either of those ideologies. They're hooked on the violence elements of that. Of course, that is subject to much study and much more study that we have to do to understand it.
Let's talk about the young people, because it was clear in some of the information that we saw that emerged at the time of the joint counter-terrorism raids that there were those things you're talking about, small groups, very speedy radicalisation, but young people in particular. What responsibility does the community have and do families have?
Yeah, absolutely.
Today?
So when the police or security service is involved, it's too late. There's acts in preparation, acts underway. We all have a responsibility. This is the whole of society: parents, caregivers, educators, coaches and sporting team, everyday people. It's really important, knowing what your children are up to, knowing what is captivating them online. Of course, we can have a long conversation about the difficulties in managing all of that, but that's incredibly important. In COVID, when people were locked down, 50% of my priority counter-terrorism caseload were minors. Locked in their bedroom, on their devices. You can fall down a rabbit hole of hate quickly. Not moderated by the events of schoolyard and community groups, all the positive benefits of family outings. Of course, COVID's no longer with us, but it's still an issue. It's a concern how social media can grab people quickly, the internet can grab people quickly, and hurt young brains which are not fully formed.
And so in the case of these events that we're looking at this year, you've mentioned so far you have got some part of Sunni violent extremism. You've got far left meets far right. What else is in that mix?
Neonazis are a big portion of our mix, so that's long been a thing in this country. At one point it was 50% of our investigative caseload. It's dropped off, but it's still prominent. They're still active. Most of the work of neo-Nazis is to recruit to their cause, unlikely to go to acts of terrorism. Of course, it's the individuals that come into those groups and don't like that moderation, or elements of that neo-Nazi ideology that are called accelerationists, those people who want to bring down society, and they will undertake acts to accelerate the downfall of society as we know it today.
And what do we know about the connections that people, especially young people, have with individuals overseas? I know you say there's a lot of people who are radicalising very quickly, but there are still influential older people involved, aren't there?
There are, but we also have on the first side youngsters who are actually leading groups. So that's kind of it's a thing. In the neo-Nazi space, accelerationists, there is a group that's connected globally. They use apps where they're talking to each other, Telegram and a channel called Telegram, and they're communicating with each other. They're generating manuals, they're sharing information on how to do attacks or how to disrupt a power station, because accelerationists will turn the power off to try and bring society down.
What's an accelerationist?
So it's people with a far-right ideology, neo-Nazi, or even further, where they believe in white supremacy and they don't like the way the world is run today, and they want it to downfall to return things to what they believe is the rightful order.
And you said that in relation to some of these behaviours, they did gain momentum after the terrorist attacks on Israel and accelerated during Israel's response. What role then in that element of this, what role is the war playing?
Well, it's not a direct, so we didn't raise the threat level in direct response to the conflict in Gaza, but of course it has an indirect impact. It has driven protest, it has driven division. And those protests are getting very emotional, and there's been spontaneous violence, and it becomes a bit of its own weather system, and the wrong thing happens and it fires up the other wrong thing. So it's driving very strong emotions and strong reactions. And again, that's our concern. Violence is more permissible for your political objective or promoting your cause. Peaceful protest is absolutely fine in this country. Lawful dissent is fine. But when it becomes unpeaceful and unlawful, that's when we know we have a problem.
What role do politicians have then in this moment, particularly when it comes to language?
Politicians have an exceptional role here, but so does the whole of community. After the 7th of October, I put out a statement that said, inflamed language, inflamed tension leads to violence. Politicians absolutely lead the charge there in terms of being careful of their words and actions. The media, if I may, the media have a responsibility in terms of how they report. By all means, report what you need to report, but how you do it really does matter.
Now, we've got used to you talking about espionage and in particular foreign interference. So with this increase that's led to this new designation, I presume that doesn't mean that foreign interference and espionage has diminished in any way.
Sadly not. Espionage and foreign interference are still principal security concerns, and unfortunately, as of today, so is politically motivated violence. My agency is stretched, but our job is to identify these threats and with our partners in law enforcement and elsewhere deal with them.
Let me just ask you this. Formally, we're talking about informal groupings here, but just on the formal side, do Hamas and Hezbollah have representatives, strong connections in Australia?
There are people in this country that will be sympathetic to and may well support them. Of course, if they're supporting them, they're breaking the law, and if we find them, the police will be informed and that will be dealt with. We don't have active Hamas or Hezbollah groups plotting things in this country. Absolutely not.
At the same time, we know that the Iranian Secret Service have moved against media representatives in other parts of the world. There was a stabbing in London. Do they pose a threat in the same way in Australia?
We've caught the Iranians here surveilling individuals in this country. They're a country that's capable of dealing with threats to their country as they see them, including surveillance and potentially worse. Of course, when we see that, we deal with it. And a few years ago, Minister O'Neill was talking about how we found that and we dealt with that.
When you say potentially worse, can you explain what you mean by potentially worse?
Up to including lethal operations, as in killing someone.
As in assassinations.
Yes.
Has that threat continued after the last time it was talked about?
We keep an open investigation to that, but of course in public I wouldn't disclose what we know because obviously that might stop us from doing our job well.
You just mentioned that you are stretched because you're talking about having to deal with a huge number of fronts, different ideologies, as well as espionage and foreign interference. Does ASIO need more money with the dangerous world we live in?
We are stretched, but you appreciate if I needed more money, I'd ask that in private to government. My job as Director on Security is to make sure I have the laws and the resource to do our job. We're stretched is probably all I want to say publicly.
Mike Burgess, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thanks for your time.